There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is an area as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is an area of both light and shadow, science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone. That's the introduction to the first season of Rod Serling's brilliant science fiction anthology, The Twilight Zone, which ran for 5 seasons from 1959 to 1962. Of the 171 episodes, Serling wrote 121 of them by himself, which took a bit of a toll on him, as influenced somewhat his decision to step back from the writing role in his next anthology series, Night Gallery. He also handed over the production duties to Gino Swark, which I think was a good idea. But to begin with the Twilight Zone, it started actually as an episode on the Desilu Playhouse called The Time Element, in which a sailor is just talking with somebody at the bar, and he happens to see a photo of a guy, and he says, "Who's that?" And he says, "Oh, that's so-and-so. He died during the attack on Pearl Harbor." And somehow, by simply staring at this photograph, he is transported back in time to December 7th, 1941, and tries to warn people that the Japanese are coming and that there's going to be a sneak attack, and nobody will pay any attention to him. They'll think he's a crackpot and a nut. And the final scene you see is there's another person in the same bar looking at a picture of the same guy. The guy who went back in time says, "Who's that?" And he says, "Oh, that's Jim Smith. He was killed in Pearl Harbor." So there's an ironic twist there. Unfortunately, Desi came in and made some kind of doofy comments at the end about, was this a dream or was it real? We don't know what happened. But that was the seed from which Serling adapted the idea of doing a half-hour anthology of science fiction series. Something else that spurred it on was the fact that, and something that people today don't really realize this, sponsors had a lot to do with what got on the air and what didn't get on the air at the time. Serling talked about a friend of his. It wasn't him. I don't remember if it was Mort Saul or someone else, but someone had written a screenplay that had to do with the Holocaust for Playhouse 90. And the author of that, it wasn't Serling, it was a friend of his, said he objected to the fact that one of the sponsors wouldn't allow him to use the term oven when he was referring to the gas chambers at the Nazi concentration camps, because they were a manufacturer of ovens. I think it was a Manna or another company like that, and wouldn't let them use the term oven. And the writer got very incensed. But that kind of taught a lesson to Serling that you can't talk about certain things. Like, he wanted to do a teleplay about Emmett Till, and the people who were going to produce the teleplay said, "No, you're not doing this. There's no way. We're not going to let you do it. It won't go in the South. We're not going to let you do a thing about Emmett Till." So instead, he wrote things like "I Am the Night, Color Me Black" and "The Big Tall Wish," which somehow addressed at least some of those issues, if not directly. He also was able, by using the science fiction format, he was able to address things like prejudice in such stories as The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, where there's an imaginary invasion from outer space and people instantly start turning on each other. The Shelter, which is even more, emphasizes that factor more when people are put into the situation where they think World War III is broken out and they start acting like savages. And other social issues, like I said, they did, in the "I Am the Night, Color Me Black," which deals with the injustice and, the injustice of the death penalty, and was able to present these, dealt with, forced societal conformity in such episodes as Number 12 Looks Just Like You, where everybody's forced to go under an operation when they get to 18, and they only get to choose certain body types that match. And that was also addressed in Eye of the Beholder, where there's a dictatorial society that turns out to be quite the opposite of what we expect. But they all force people to conform. The surprise about that conformity, which I won't ruin for people who haven't seen it, but it's the opposite of what we think. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that it was about this state that didn't tolerate any difference from their quote-unquote norm. So he was able to talk about these things. He even managed to address the Vietnam War in one of the fifth season episodes, In Praise of Pip, starring Jack Klugman and Billy Mooney, where he mentions, that his son Pip was killed in Vietnam, and quote unquote, there's not even supposed to be a war there. In 1960, there wasn't. We were already there. We were there as early as, I think, 58 or 59 as quote unquote political advisors, which is weasel words for mercenaries, because that's what they were. Don't kid yourselves, folks. We were doing the killing. It wasn't, we're just advising people. No, bullshit. And then, again, he was able to use the format of science fiction to present these ideas in ways that wouldn't offend anybody, so none of the sponsors would get their hairs on end. With other episodes, TV series, I have, top 10, top 20 lists. With the Twilight Zone, it's like top 100. I can just go on and on about, which ones I love. I love A Stop at Willoughby, even though it talks about suicide. I liked, Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up, where Jack Elam says, how many legs? How many legs? Great stuff there. And again, some of these episodes were done as comedies. That has to be mentioned. Not all of them were strictly science fiction. There were fantasy episodes like The Changeling and Jess Bell was more of a fantasy episode than a science fiction episode. And they had some brilliant writers. Other than Serling, they had people like Charles Beaumont, who wrote Number 12 Looks Just Like You. And Richard Matheson wrote a number of episodes. Manly Wade Wellman wrote the story for Jess Bell, and a couple of others, I think. And some really, really good top-notch writers. And the writing shows, and the acting, of course, is great. And we've got William Shatner in one of his first and best scenery-chewing scenes in Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. There's a man on the wing of the plane. You have expecting a call for Spock, that he doesn't. And the epic battle between the state and the individual presented in The Obsolete Man with Fritz Weaver and facing off against Burgess Meredith's quote-unquote obsolete librarian. Third from the Sun with, again, Fritz Weaver and Edward Andrews as a very menacing, Edward Andrews is always menacing, character, and again, a twist ending. I love the episode. This is not one of people's favorites, but it's one of mine, Uncle Simon, starring the great Cedric Hardwicke and Constance Ford. And he just badgers and harries. One of my favorite speeches in the whole thing. I think Serling wrote that one as well. I have to look that up. But Cedric Hardwicke, I won't spoil the ending for you, but there's a twist. And the character who Cedric Hardwicke becomes, says, Barbara, my dear, if you could prevail upon that Raggedy Ann carcass of yours to exert itself, I'd like a cup of hot chocolate, like in the English bone china cup. If it's not hot, I'll throw it on the floor. And he says, well, what does it take to get you to move, you bovine crab, you torpid lotus eater? I just lost it. Even as a kid, I knew what those words meant, and I thought that was really funny. He says other things like, you peanut-headed sample of nature's carelessness. He says to her, Barbara, you're the only woman I know who looks as if underneath her clothes she wore clothes. You have all the grace and femininity of a high-button shoe. Again, you can't help but crack up at lines like that, even though they're horrible and sexist. But, and again, the whole thing was really, very nasty. But, again, funny. I like the brain center at Whipple's with Albert Salmi chewing the scenery like wild, saying, when you're dead and buried, who are you going to get to board for you? I love that. Just some epic, epic performances throughout the whole thing. Death Ship, one of the hour-long episodes. Give a bit more background. The first 3 episodes were half an hour, and that format worked very well, but they decided in the 4th season to try hour-long episodes. And the results were somewhat mixed. While we did get some great episodes like Death Ship, on Thursday We Leave for Home, Judgment Night, and Miniature, Valley of the Shadow, In His Image, Mute, and a number of others. We got some clunkers like Passage on the Lady Anne, which I really didn't get into. And it really was not padding out the stories, I think, kind of killed some of the suspense of the half-hour format. So they went back to the half-hour format for the final fifth season. And again, they were starting to peter out on ideas by the time, as can be seen in episodes like The Fear and Cavender is Coming and Ring-a-Ding Girl, which are all kind of and The Bewitching Pool, which I really loathe, just like a bad kiddie show episode, which meant to talk about the effect of divorce on young children. It didn't really do that good a job, in my opinion. But again, some brilliant acting performances, far too many episodes for me to go through my entire top 10 list. But it often dealt with controversial subjects, like I said, prejudice, fear, hatred, Cold War paranoia, the difficulties we may encounter when we go explore space in such great episodes as Elegy and Third from the Sun, and a few others. The show was not without its controversies. They did a version of Ray Bradbury's I Sing the Body Electric, which I thought was really good. Very faithful adaptation, I thought. Bradbury was not happy with it, and he had been planning to sell them a couple of other episodes, including Here Be Tigers, which unfortunately did not get produced. I would have loved to have seen that as a Twilight Zone episode. But Bradbury was upset that apparently Serling rewrote part of his script and without his permission, and he did not like that. Actually, the final episode that they broadcast was not either written by Serling. It was not really a Twilight Zone episode. It was a French movie of Ambrose Bierce's story, Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, and Serling bought the rights to it and added a wraparound story, added an intro and an outro. But it was really just that film, which I had seen at a movie festival and recognized it when I saw it. I was like, huh, why did they do this? But it still comes off rather well because a lot of Bierce's work is very Twilight Zone-esque. It has, shock endings and fits very well into the format. Terrific show, great acting, great dialogue, great sets for the great special effects for the time. If you don't believe me, look at episodes like in The Obsolete Man. You open on these enormous doors, and they actually built those doors, and this long table, and at the top of this enormous dais, Fritz Weaver is poised, and he looks absolutely like an absolute dictator. Without those sets, that wouldn't have worked. Some of the effects look cheesy, like the effects in The Invaders of the little spacemen who are obviously just little wind-up robot toys. But you have to remember they didn't have the budget back then of science fiction shows today. For what it was brilliant, and if you have not seen it, I highly recommend it. And take that next step into the Twilight Zone.